Finally, those who have not yet received the gospel are related in various ways to the people of God. In the first place, we must recall that people to whom the testament and the promises were given and from whom Christ was born according to the flesh. On account of their fathers, these people remains most dear to God, for God does not repent of the gift he makes, nor of the calls he issues. We are talking about the Jews, of course. But the plan of salvation also includes those who acknowledge the Creator. In the first place, amongst these, there are the Muslims, who professing to hold the faith of Abraham, inter quos in primis musulmanus, qui fidem Abrae se tenere profitentes, along with us, adore the one and merciful God, who on the last day will judge mankind. This originally Latin quotation does not belong to a medieval polemic, but to a church document issued 60 years ago. I am referring to the dogmatic constitution of the Church Lumen Gentium, promulgating by Pope Paul VI on November 21st, 1964, 1 year before the end of the Second Vatican Council. In paragraph 16 of chapter 2, entitled On the People of God, Jews and Muslims are defined one after the other in exegetical and soteriological terms by pointing to their common origins in Abraham. It must be noticed that in an earlier draft of this document, Muslims were defined as Fili Ismaelis, sons of Ismael, Genesis 25:16, but 230 modi, or objections, against this label were raised by the members of the council, who in the end opted for the ecclesiastical Latin term Musulmani. This definition was further elaborated in chapter 3 of a shorter, yet equally important document known as Nostra Aetate, the declaration on the relation of the Church to non-Christian religions proclaimed by Paul VI on October 28, 1965, 2 months before the conclusion of the Council. The first of 3 references to Abraham is very meaningful to us. The Church regards with esteem also the Muslims. They adore the one God, living and subsisting in himself, merciful and all-powerful, the creator of heaven and earth, who has spoken to man. They take pains to submit wholeheartedly to even his inscrutable decrees. Just as Abraham, with whom the faith of Islam takes the pleasure in linking itself, submitted to God. Sicut Deus et submisit Abraham ad quem fides Islamica libenter se refert. After emphasizing the common grounds between Christians and Muslims in terms of doctrine and religious practices, the Council Fathers made clear the pastoral aim behind this declaration. Since in the course of centuries, not a few quarrels and hostilities have arisen between Christians and Muslims, this sacred synod urges all to forget the past and to work sincerely for mutual understanding and to preserve, as well as to promote together for the benefits of all mankind, social justice and moral welfare, as well as peace and freedom. For historians, unfortunately, the past cannot be forgotten, but must be studied if only to understand the present and not to repeat the mistakes of the father. For this reason, I would like to discuss an aspect of these documents that might be of some relevance to a project entitled the European Qur'an. The definition of Islam emerging from Vatican II, based on the self-identification of Muslims with Abraham, has impacted faculties of theology, the subsequent production of papal documents, up to actually the first papal document by Francis I. I cannot linger on it, but it's extremely interesting. It's a first quotation of the Quran in a contemporary papal document, as well as the international research into the history of Jewish, Christian, Muslims relations of the last half of a century. Its resonance is one of the reasons, neither a self-evident nor an undisputed one, that prompted the initiation of a field of study known as History of the Abrahamic Religions. In a recent volume in honor of David Thomas, an Anglican priest, a scholar of Christian-Muslim relations in the Middle Ages, and the founder of the Brill series, Christian-Muslim Relations, a Bibliographical History, Michael Ipgrave suggested that the conception of Islam reflected in Nostra Aetate might have been influenced by Louis Massignon. The question, to tell the truth, had already been posed by a white father and expert on Islam, Robert Caspar, in 1970, during the first stage of an intense, lacerating, and never concluding meditation on the conciliar legacy. To verify this hypothesis on a philological level, it would be necessary to examine what Massignon wrote about Abraham and the Quran, this close connection, from his youthful writings up to his dissertation on Al-Hallaj, discussed at the Sorbonne in 1922, and to compare these outcomes to his late autobiographical and spiritual writings. Since, of course, I cannot do it here, I restrain myself to a few quotations from his earliest and latest works, on the publication of which the author himself, who was strict in distinguishing scientific study of ancient and medieval sources from their spiritual and militant interpretations, raised serious reservations which were only partly dissolved soon before his death with the publication of reduced edition supervised by the author or by his son Daniel. Developed between academic studies in Paris, field research in Islamic countries, and personal experience among Muslims, this conception of Islam is in many respects the result of Massignon's interpretation of the definition of Abraham given in the Quran. In an article published anonymously, and this is significant too, in 1922, the same year of his dissertation, he defined Muslims in light of the controversial genealogy of Abraham provided in Genesis 17 and 22. Quotation. In fact, his race, the Arab race, is descendant from Abraham by way of Ismail, the sons of Hagar, the maidservants exiled into the desert. Immediately afterwards, Massignon switched from defining Muslims to defining the Quran. Their unique book, the Qur'an, combines and condenses fragments of the Pentateuch, the Psalters, and the Gospel under a singularly elliptical form. This book, which a superior restraint seems to seal, imprisons under several literal and earthly equivocations the sources of grace springing up in our sacred text, as if the Quran was to the Bible what Ismail, the one expelled, was to Isaac. Massignon walked in the footsteps of a well-established Christian exegesis of the Quran, rooted in the controversy over the genesis and natures of Muhammad's revelation, and on a broader level in the understanding of the Quranic text as an artificial mixture between Jewish and Christian scriptures. In the Hijrah of Ismail, the most extensive, frantic, and sophisticated of the three prayers of Abraham, written between 1935 and 1949, unfinished and published posthumously, he offers further confirmation of this useful argument. In chapter 7, he defines the Quran as follows. The Quran is a very mysteriously condensed and cyclically structured compendium with frequent duplications of historical anecdotes, qisas, drawn at times from Judeo-Christian background, political actuality, and old Arab paganism, which is legitimate, he claims, since it consists of mere examples taken here and there ad extra, for the Hagarians had been excluded from messianic privileges. Enlarging on this idea in chapter 10, Massignon foreran the ecclesiological languages that would inspire the synodal intention of Vatican II, aim at reconciling internal schisms with the Church, within the Church, and addressing external challenges in the name of ecumenical unity. Here the Quran is defined in the mirror not only of the Torah and the Gospels, but also of three reinterpretations of the Jewish and Christian scriptures, respectively, namely Samaria, or the Samaritan tradition, pretty weird definition, the Talmud, and the Greek Orthodox theology, both regarded, all three regarded as heterodox. Definition, another definition by Massignon, it's a huge development within his thinking of how to define the Quran from his youthful writings up to his death. It is an Hagarian community of an ecclesial type, founded on the unity of worship and identified by its common good, a book, the Quran, which amalgamates and condenses, as we have seen, with not inconsiderable fragments of the Torah, the Psalter, and the Gospels, the legislative work of Muhammad, and which claims, first of all, for the descendants of Ismail, admitted to the first covenant with God, that of circumcision, also participation in the second covenant of Abraham, that on the Mount Moriah, it's the sacrifice of Isaac or Ismail. we are almost confronted with an Abrahamic schism, as Samaria and Talmudism were Mosaic schisms, as Greek Orthodoxy was a post-Chalcedonian schism. The Quran as a scriptural condensation, Muslims as descendants of Ismail, a church-oriented community to be compassionately looked upon because it is marginalized and excluded. As you can see, on the one side, Massignon's language and concerns foreshadow the message flowed in the conciliar documents. On the other side, they rework medieval claims, such as that Muslims were schismatics. The latter idea harken back to Dante, as Roberta Morosini yesterday perfectly shows to us, whose relevance to Christian-Muslim relations Massignon knew very well. In 1919, he was one of the first and only scholars to review positively Miguel Azim Palacios' controversial work on the Islamic sources on the Commedia Divina. In the full version of the Hijra of Ismail, however, Massignon went far beyond these arguments, revealing an Abrahamic conception of Islam according to which it is the latter, Islam, in place of Judaism and Christianity, that represents, after hope and charity, the third and most important of the theological virtues, namely faith. Rhetorically brilliant, Massignon transferred the figural interpretation to which both prophetic Judaism and Christianity has resorted to unchain themselves from the origins, by respectively opposing the faith of Abraham to the corruption of the temple, Judaism, and the faith in Christ prefigured in Adam to the law of Moses. Quotation, if Israel is rooted in hope and Christianity is devoted to charity, Islam is centered on faith. Islamic observance is first and foremost the reminder of a creed, while Jewish observances ritualizes the commandments set forth in the sworn covenant, and Christian observance, after the truth of its creed and the duties of the commandments, makes use of the sacraments to sanctify through the virtues. He was obsessed by the sacraments, mystically speaking. This Abrahamic perspective, according to which the Tanakh, the Gospels, and the Quran are closely interrelated, and none of the three religions can be explained without the other, is carried to extremes in an autobiographical memoir of 1949. Its conception of Islam reflects a Christian perspective based on salvation history and retribution theology, according to which historical events, including the rise and spread of Islam, are a deterministic consequences, as constructive as painful, of the sins and religious faults attributed to Christians. Islam exists and continues to subsist because of his Abrahamic faith, to force the Christians to rediscover a more bare, more primitive, more simple form of sanctification, which Muslims admittedly only attain very rarely, but through our fault, because we have not yet shown it to them into us. And this is what they expect from us, from Christ. Reworked through updated critical and linguistic tools, these late arguments resumes conviction that Massignon, in fact, had expressed as early as 1917. At the age of 24, being in Egypt during the First World War, he was urged by a friend to write a refutation of Tufat al-Adib, the gift of the learned man, an anti-Christian polemic penned in 1423 by the Moroccan renegade Abdallah ibn al-Torjoman, later identified in Anselm Turmeda, which yesterday, if I remember well, Maxime mentioned also here in our discussions. To define the Quran, Massignon sticks to a literary genre and a language peculiar to medieval polemics. Consequently, if the divine word, being one and simple, can reasonably be a divine person and also express itself among men by a single incarnation, it is impossible to identify it with a book, which can be discursively expanded by a multiplicity of distinct concepts. Now, to decree that the Quran is the divine word is to regard it at the same time as a text composed of concepts, words, and letters, and as a simple divine thought juxtaposed with the divine essence by a pre-eternal, incomprehensible miracle. This is unacceptable. This Christian interpretation of Islam can be summarized in the definition of the Quran as an Abrahamic rather than a Muhammad revelation, and ultimately in the recognition of the superiority of the Quran, seen as complementary to the negative outcomes of the reception of the Gospels by Christians throughout centuries, over the Prophet Muhammad. Much more could be said, of course, about this, but I have to stop at this quotation regarding Massignon. Confutation, retribution theology, salvation history, figural interpretation of the scriptures, conception of the Quran as an unnatural combination of Jewish and Christian scriptures, rejection of its nature as a divine word. I need not to emphasize here the extent to which this hermeneutical perspective echo and resume those that, albeit in distinct political and religious context, have shaped centuries of Christian literature on the Quran from the late medieval to the early modern times. Despite the endurance of this legacy, there is almost no trace of its assessment, critical assessment, in the debates on the relation between Christianity and Islam that have spanned from Vatican II to the academic development of new and epistemologically turning disciplines such as theology of religions and history of the Abrahamic religions. The reason must be that medieval debates on the Quran, from a theological, pastoral, and political point of view, are regarded as inconvenient, divisive, and at any rate outdated. On closer inspection, however, it is precisely between this medieval literature that the creative discussion on the identity of Abraham in the Quran, and thus the definition of the Quran as the law or religion of Abraham, emerges and develops through a refined exegesis and an hermeneutical pluralism that proves immune, paradoxically, to any dogmatic synthesis. This lexicon and literatures, as an investigation of Massignon medieval sources will prove, and I wish to conduct it one day, were the core of his writings on Islam, which have been progressively softened and simplified up to the point of being misrepresented, especially in the reception of the nebulous reception of the Vatican documents. An idolater, a patriarch, a monotheist, the first circumcised man, the executioner of Isaac or Ismail, a prefiguration of Christ, a Muslim or a Hanif. The 20th century discussion of Abraham's identity according to Old Testament and the Gospels and the Quran is the consequences of a tripartite approach that originated in the first half of the 12th century and, as the result of an inseparable amalgam of philological, exegetical, and theological debates around the Bible, have shaped interfaith disputes until today. Without the outcomes of a Christian exegesis of the Old Testament, the Christian interest in the Quranic definition of Abraham and in the definition of the Quran itself would be inconceivable. The dispute over Abraham's religious identity, which flourished at the time of the Second Crusade, demonstrates this. Likely in Cluny, under Peter the Venerable's protection, Peter Abelard wrote his celebrated Collationes, better known as Dialogus, and left unfinished, between a philosopher, a Jew, and a Christian, where the relationship between the Jewish law and the Gospels, and between these two laws and the law of nature, lex naturae, with which later Christian scholars identify the Quran, was central. Drawing on the narrative of the covenant, drawing on the narrative of the Church Father and the exegetical legacy, the philosopher of the dialogue elaborates upon the narrative of the covenant between God and Abraham of Genesis 17, and the conclusion is that God has granted blessing to Abraham not because of and beginning from the rite of circumcision, but because of his previous act of obedience through which the patriarch had agreed on sacrificing his son, Isaac. If the law had begun with circumcision, it was not, however, because of the law that Abraham was prized by God, but because of the willingness to sacrifice his son, which preceded the institution of the law and fulfilled God's previous promise to Abraham. In Abelard's tripartite dialogue, the Christian clearly appears as the successor of the biblical Gentile in the spiritual interpretation and overcoming of the Jewish law and rights. This is confirmed by a less studied but extremely interesting work by Abelard, his commentaries on Paul's letters to the Romans, written in the same years of the Collationes, where Abelard again tackles the issue of circumcision. He draws on Paul's lexicon to distinguish between the concept of signum, with its carnal and external character, and that of signaculum, with its internal and spiritual character. Circumcision concerned both Jews and Gentiles, and therefore Christians. A signium for Jews, quotation, the carnal children of Abraham, it was a signaculum for Gentiles, quotation, the spiritual children of Abraham, and for all those who embrace God by mind and heart, not by flesh, that is, for true Christians. Following Paul's figure of thinking, Abelard defines Abraham, by reason of the rite of circumcision, as the father of the Jews according to the flesh and the father of the Gentiles according to the faith. As you can notice, it is exactly the same language and theological pattern in which the declaration Lumen Gentium from Vatican II resorted to define the role of the Jews in Christian salvation history immediately before introducing the much debated paragraph on the Muslims. Like in the 12th century, in the 60s of the 19th century, the Catholic Church, gathered in council, had no other way to define Islam and the Quran except in typological relation to Judaism. This sounds like an anachronism, but it is not. What Christians wrote in the 12th century about the faith and circumcision of Abraham by regarding the Old Testament typologically resurfaced with regard to the Quran as soon as Peter the Venerable's collection of Islamic writings in Latin translation, first and foremost, of course, Robert of Quetz's Al-Quran, was made available in Western Europe. Because of its profound influence upon later writings on Islam, both in Latin and vernacular, I will linger only on the most relevant of these writings, the so-called Risalat of the Pseudo-Al-Kindi or Epistola Saraceni Rescriptum Christiani, whose impact on Latin and French literature, Florence Tinnit and recently also Irene Reginato have carefully investigated. Just this last example from medieval literature to come back to the connection which I tried to pinpoint at the beginning. Originally written in Arabic in the Near East, around the 9th century, it consists of an imaginary epistolary exchange between Al-Hashimi, an Orthodox Muslim and apologist for Islam, and Al-Kindi, a Muslim convert to Christianity eager to show his interlocutor the superiority of the Christian faith. In the 4th chapter of his letter, Al-Hashimi lingers on Abraham's religious identity according to the Quran. Quotation, for God, blessed be he and glorious, while promising us the reward of regeneration, made us safe from the sentence of judgment on the day of the resurrection of the dead, when he said, the seed of Abraham, fully Muslims. And he also said, great and glorious, those who believe in our science and were Muslims. And he diligently adds, he was neither a Jew nor a Christian, but a sincere Muslim, talking about Abraham. In chapter 10, Al-Hashimi suggested Abraham, as a Muslim, was the common ancestor of Christians and Muslims. Quotation, our community, in fact, is the descendant of Abraham, our ancestor, and yours, who was fully Muslim. The Latin lexicon is extremely interesting. At the beginning of his response, Al-Kindi reacted to Al-Hashimi's interpretation by comparing the narrative of Abraham's deeds in the Quran to that of the book of Genesis. Al-Kindi is the Christian, probably a convert from Islam, and his identity, of course, is very controversial. First, he rejected the Islamic claim that Hanifiya means conversion for idolatry, showing that it rather pointed to the opposite, namely, to the condition of idolatry experienced by Abraham when he dwelt with his father in Haran before embracing the worship of the one God and living alone for Canaan at the age of 75. He specified that before his conversion, Abraham worshipped an idol called Al-Huzza, belonging to lunar cults, this is Venus, and that after his conversion, Isaac, the promised son, made the holder of that unity. Here I do not agree with the editor of this Latin text who translated monotheism for unitas in Latin because it's a very much problematic word, unitas. The holder or possessor or heir of that unity. This refined exegetical reasoning results in Al-Kindi's ascribing to Abraham two distinct types of faiths, morally and chronologically ordered. Abraham has two faiths, one before his conversion and one afterwards. He urged his Muslim interlocutor to choose clearly between them, either the idolatrous Abraham described in the Quran, or the Abraham believing in one God, a foreshadow of the Christ of the Gospel. We therefore know that Abraham, from his birth until he was 90 years old, there is a misinterpretation because Genesis says 75 years, was Hanif, that is idolatrous. From then On he believed in God and was always faithful. O you men, God help you, who invite me to the faith of Abraham and to his community. I wish I knew which of the two faiths of his you want to invite me to, or in which of the two ways of life of his commanded me to be, whether he was an idolater with all his kindred in Haran, or when, after leaving Haran, he knew the one God and worshipped him and obeyed him and his commands. He emigrated from his land and was a city of error and a house of unfaithfulness. According to Al-Kindi, the first Muslim was not Abraham but Muhammad, as the Prophet himself stated in the Quran, 6:14. Al-Kindi defiantly asked Al-Hashimi what a Muslim's audience would do if he was seen to speak for the Jew and plea for his cause instead of the Islamic one. If Al-Hashimi had tried to convince him to adopt Abraham's faith attitude, it would have spoken for the Jews, or would have been himself a Jew, because, quotation, it is the Jew and not you Muslim, who is concerned with the question of who Abraham was and what he did. To the eyes of an Arab Christian of Muslim origins like Al-Kindi, discussing Abraham's identity meant for a Muslim to present himself as a Jew. I conclude. I guess its time is over. Unlike contemporary scholars of the Bible and the Quran, most of medieval readers did not have the text of the Quran isolated on their desks. As a cautionary measure, it was accompanied by apologetic writings, chronicles of the Crusade, military treatises, account of travels, and of course a significant number of marginal notes. The way in which from the 12th to 15th century Latin translations, epitomes, fragments, direct or indirect quotation of the Quran were handed down in manuscript bring material evidence of this hermeneutical approach. Despite these theological watchdogs, the Quran kept challenging the revelation foreshadowed by Old Testament prophets and fulfilled in the law of the Gospels, to the point of prompting Christians to reconsider the whole history of revelation, starting from the very God promised to Abraham, his circumcision, and the required sacrifice of his firstborn. The definition and the contestation of the Quran depended in many respects on the definition and contestation of Abraham's words, belief, and deeds at the beginning of salvation history. This was true in the 12th centuries, this is true in the 13th, 14th, 15th, and I'm working on the sources in order to explain how this develops in the Middle Ages, and this was true for Massignon and in the conciliar document which he supposedly, but he has inspired. Thank you very much.